Okay, so this lecture is going to focus on the history of Mexico, particularly the national history from the 1970s up into the 1990s. And this time period is known for pretty much a lot of corruption in Mexican politics, which I mean just kind of peaks around 1994 with Salinas's government. It's not a time remembered fondly. I think, especially if you think of the years 1968, between that symbolic year and 1994 as symbolic years. And it's important to keep in mind with how this politics turns out. Um, Sometimes it's referred to as the period of the dinosaurs versus technocrats. So dinosaurs are kind of like the old guard of the pre, whereas the technocrats are kind of this educated, young, a lot of them are American educated economists who are going to be rising in the ranks in national politics. Now, the first president is Luis Escheveria. And Escheveria is famous for actually possibly being the mastermind behind the 1968 massacre, since he was part of the administration. And there's a lot of allegations directed towards him. He never does get that, you know, pinned on him. In fact, that whole event is still kind of up in the air. Um, he's famous for taking Mexico in a populist stance, which reminds me of similar Latin American countries during this time period. So he's openly spouting off a type of neo-populist language and policies. I guess one of his most famous phrases is "onwards and upwards." But bottom line, there's still numerous attacks on student movements, and there's a rise of what's known as the dirty war during this time period, where you do have these kind of anarchist, socialist, guerrilla movements roaming around Mexico. And one way to look at it is the violence against these groups by the government were not as like infamous as like in Argentina or maybe in Pinochet's Chile, but there are people who are disappearing during this time period, and it does seem to be pinned back on Echeverria. Um, and frankly, for all his populism and these policies, some historians say this might have been the worst economic administration in Mexican history, and that kind of is saying a lot. So with Echeverria, you have the first of the populist presidents, where you have this again, all this language of populism, but and leftist, politics and the government expanding, but like it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. It's kind of catch up to Mexico eventually, and it does kind of fit the signs of the times across Latin America in the midst of the Cold War. And think about it, we are really kind of looking at the rise of this populist element, and then it's going to turn into this neoliberal creature with the rise of Salinas. Okay, the next president is Portillo, and things go from bad to worse. He does nationalize all the banks, but and again, it's very similar language about upward and onward from Mexico. However, as the tail end of his administration comes to an end, it is the 1982 debt crisis, and this is infamous in Mexico. This is one of the worst economic crises in Mexican history. It's a complete disaster, and basically they squandered all the wealth that came from this petroleum that's discovered, and he defaults on debt. And I guess what's ironic is this guy literally has to leave Mexico because he's so hated after his administration is over. And supposedly he would talk about that he would defend the peso like a dog. I guess that's a really famous statement he made. Then he says this, and then like within a couple of weeks, like the peso is totally devaluated. So that 1982 debt crisis really shocks the Mexican economy during the 1980s. This is the quote lost decade 1980s. Um, and this I think does really ramp up even the migration into the United States from Mexico during this time period. I mean, I'll read you a passage out of Juan Pablo Villalobos' novel Quesadillas to kind of illustrate some of the problems of the lost decade. Anyways, Hurtado comes to power, and he's really a non-factor. This is somebody who is kind of transitioned to the beginning of neoliberalism, where you try to begin to privatize things a little bit more. But he inherited the mess from the 1970s, and eventually has to adopt austerity measures, very severe austerity measures. So that means not paying public employees or firing a bunch of public employees. So it's a really, really big mess. Not to mention that the government is totally inept in handling the major earthquake that happened in Mexico City. This is pretty famous stuff. Happened in 1985. And again, it was such a disaster. We're talking thousands and thousands of people killed in this earthquake. And the government was very slow in reacting and trying to, fix the situation. In fact, in some ways, the United States does intervene to help out with some of these economic crises that are hitting Mexico. So in that sense, with this administration, there has been some repair that's went on with relationship between the United States and Mexico. That's actually going to even get better under Salinas. So, with the PRI having this kind of record ever since 1968, you'd think like, oh boy, it's everybody's itching for change, and that just doesn't happen. And it's not that they didn't try. So, the 1988 election is going to be, it's like a three-way run election with Cardenas, who is related to the most famous Mexican president in history, maybe next to Juarez. He is going to run, and he's kind of what you would call somebody to the left, somewhat progressive, adept. He has experience. Cuauhtemoc Cardenas is looks like he's going to win this election, but unfortunately, he loses. It Many people now just think this was fraud. There was like quote unquote computer failure that happened. This is the system failure of this election, and the pre-candidate Salinas will win this election. In response to this, Cardenas forms a new party, and 1988 was nicknamed the Democratic Current for Mexican national politics. Not that, anything really changed, but I guess in some ways it's an ideological change. It did show that, hey, wait a second, they had to cheat to win, and maybe PRI is vulnerable after all. So that's how the 1988 election is kind of seen in Mexican consciousness. Okay, well, this leads us to the quote unquote neoliberal 1990s, and maybe I'll talk about neoliberalism live with you when we meet. But the big thing is this is the election of Salinas, as was just said, probably through fraud, and he attempts a neoliberal economic strategy. So whereas we've seen over the last few decades with PRI in control, that the public sector had really grown, right? It controlled the agrarian market, the oil market, the banks, etc., right? The government is really taking a much more hold over the economy. Under Salinas, he switches gears and begins to privatize a lot of businesses, including the banks. And we saw that the banks had just become public again earlier. So he reprivatizes the banks in 1990, and the big thing he does is sign NAFTA. He was looking to push Mexico into this kind of, this trend of neoliberalism that you can kind of see connected to the administrations of Reagan in the United States and Thatcher in the UK. And so Salinas felt Mexico needs to move into this world. He tries the EU first, but the EU is kind of bloated with all the former Soviet Union states moving in as new markets. So he decides to push for NAFTA here in the Americas, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the Tratado de Libre Comercio. Now, this expands into the famous maquiladora sectors, especially in the north of Mexico, and that's these big like industrial plants by these international businesses now, right? If you think about the type of businesses that are really big in the world today, they're not just American or Chinese in some ways. There is no, in a globalized world, there is no, national roots. And so a lot of that labor from U.S. companies goes down into these border states. And as you read in some of the writings, this leads to a lot of attacks against women at some of these factories. This is the so-called femicide machine that is operating here. Another thing Salinas does is push for international human rights agreements. Particularly now you have very renewed relations with the Catholic Church. This under Pope John Paul II. So this is a big shift from recent nationalist politics since the revolution, honestly, about kind of keeping the Catholic Church at bay. So this has kind of changed things within Mexico to some extent. And Salinas was very involved with some of these state elections, and that allowed a certain freedom for the opposition parties to gain some momentum and some victories. And this kind of there was a pushback within the um, 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 upper echelons of the against Salinas's almost wholehearted focus and attention towards the technocrats of his government, because he's adopting this very neoliberal strategy. So Salinas is done, and he picks Colosio to be his successor. And as you're watching the documentary 1994, Colosio is assassinated in Tijuana. So this just reminds everybody of like early Mexican history around the revolution with all the many assassinations that happened. This happens not too long after the rise of the Zapatista army in Chiapas, down in the south of Mexico. So you have this, a bunch of guerrillas associated with the indigenous activists in the south, and the government is going to try to handle it with soft gloves. They're not going to want to make a bad political move against these guerrillas, and particularly Subcomandante Marcos, who becomes like the new Che Guevara in Mexico and of the post Soviet Union age of socialism. He kind of becomes a media darling and a darling of the West. And they're still actually functioning around. It's a kind of an interesting phenomenon, but it really does capture the imagination of Latin American scholarship for about the next 20 years. And the Zapatistas are moving against this kind of neoliberalism and even the agrarian reforms that Salinas is trying to push. So with all the craziness of the 1994 election, Zedillo becomes president, and unlucky for him, he gets handed a complete economic disaster that Salinas had created.